You're listening to YARNS, conversation at the intersection of country, culture, and change. Today's guest is Gilbert AM, one of Australia's most respected legal and business leaders, and a long-time champion for justice, innovation, and Indigenous rights. Danny is the co-founder and chairman of Gilbert and Tobin, one of the country's most prominent corporate law firms. Beyond the firm, he's held major roles across the public and private sectors, including director of the Business Council of Australia, former director of NAB, chair of the Cape York Institute, and member of the Reserve Bank's Governance Board. He's also served as a chair of the National Museum of Australia, the Law and Justice Foundation, and the Australian Film, Television and Radio School. In recognition of his extraordinary contributions, Danny was appointed a member of the Order of Australia in 2005 for service to law and the community, particularly Indigenous Australians. And he has been awarded honorary Doctor of Laws degrees by both UNSW and Western Sydney University. He's also been named Law Firm Leader of the Year multiple times and was recently recognised by the Financial Times as one of the top 20 law firm leaders globally. In this episode, we yarn about Danny's early life, growing up in regional New South Wales, his time at law school, and what it was like to take the leap and found Gilbert and Tobin. We also talk about the role of business in reconciliation, the future of First Nations advocacy after the Voice referendum, and what young people, especially young First Nation lawyers, need to thrive in the profession. And of course, we touch on what's next for law itself, including how AI might reshape the work of future lawyers. It's a generous and thoughtful conversation with someone who's shaped Australian law and public life in profound ways. He's also personally shaped a lot of my decision-making recently when it comes to law school and my future. I hope you enjoyed this conversation with Danny as much as I did. For me, it's always fun to come and have a chat with you. Also a bit nerve-wracking because you tend to be quite blunt with your advice and, and your comments. And so I think it's always a bit of a nerve-wracking experience coming up here. But I think for NAIDOC Week, particularly the theme of the next generation, I kind of wanted to start there with a bit about the start of your journey in life and living and growing up in regional New South Wales out in Griffith. What was that like for you?
Well, I grew up on a rice farm about 20 miles west of Griffith, sort of towards Hay. Well, I was just a country kid growing up on a farm. Like, got the school bus every day. Yeah. Family of 6 kids, very hard-working, ambitious, impatient father. Everything was done in a great hurry. And I suppose I decided I didn't think I wanted to be a farmer. Didn't really know what to do. I remember a teacher said, "Oh, well, you should go to Sydney University and study law and you'll be fine." So that's what I did.
And that was my next question for you, is the teacher that was pretty adamant that you should go off to USyd and study law.
Yeah.
What was law school like back in those days?
Oh, incredibly intimidating.
Yeah.
I mean, I did straight law, mainly because nobody really explained to me too much about arts law. And so I was with people who'd already had a couple of years university and who were a few years older than me. And, you know, I was a very pretty gormless, really, is how I describe myself at that stage. Very inexperienced in life and had no idea why I was here or what I was doing here, really.
And was this when the law school was up near Chambers? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, and so it was pretty a daunting experience, and you're in big classes, it's all open, you know, it's not like the smallest school environment. And I had never really been to Sydney before. I was living in a university college, so I was getting used to that strange experience as well. And then at law school, it was all, looking back, probably a bit, I didn't feel overwhelmed at the time, I must say, but when I look back, it might have been a bit. But I was fine. I'm pretty resilient.
And at law school, any favourite topics that you did? Any fond memories?
Not many fond memories of law school, I must say. Fun, I don't know, I had nice memories of going to the library on a weekend with my then girlfriend.
Yep.
Who was also at Sydney University, now my wife. That was nice.
Yeah. I must say, I do like going into the law library on the weekend. I don't have a girlfriend, admittedly.
Okay.
And yeah, he's a vet. So
Yeah.
definitely not going to the law library to study with each other.
And I enjoyed living in college, but I was feeling pretty naive and just trying to figure out what was going on in the world, I guess. I didn't have any I wouldn't say I had a firm footing in anything, Harry. And I had no encouragement about tertiary education or anything much at home.
Yeah.
I was sort of on my own, really.
And were you the first person in your family to go to university?
More or less.
It's always hard being, the first one out of the nest to do that.
Yeah.
So after law school, you spent some time practicing here in the city? And then
I did undergraduate articles, spent a year here with a large law firm, and in the year I finished law school, I got married. So I did 4 years.
We don't do that these days anymore.
We don't do that anymore. So I got married when I was 22 and decided, I thought I'd like to go back to Griffith and be a country lawyer there. And I went back there for a couple of years and decided I didn't want to do that. But it was there when I reflect on it that I first had my exposure to structural Indigenous disadvantage in confronting the legal system and have a bit of experience of that.
Yeah.
I don't think it enlivened any political purpose for me, but I did get some sense of the wrongness of what I was observing.
And just acknowledged from afar that this is
I
guess not afar because
I was involved
right?
with people who had lived around on the reserve around there, who were coming into the criminal justice system. And I saw how they were treated by the cops and the system as a whole. And it was not, I had a sense there was something wrong here.
Yeah. And we'll circle back to that. I want to touch on more of your commercial career first. So you returned back from the bush
back to this firm that I'd been with,
which was Sly and Russell,
yes.
Now better known as Norton Rose Fulbright.
Yes.
Became partner at 30.
Yes.
For people who don't understand the structure of a law firm, I think 30 is a pretty young age to reach partner.
Yeah, quite young. I don't know how young it was then, but probably. Yeah, it was on the youngish side then.
And so what is it like, the traditional hierarchy of a law firm?
Well, in those days, it was very formal, unrelaxing. All the partners, it doesn't matter if they're only a couple of years older than you, they all got called Mr.
Right.
And tea lady came around. It was very Protestant, very North Shore, neither of which suited my perspective.
Yeah. Navigating that world and sort of rising the ranks, what would you say some of the qualities?
Oh, I was hardworking. I was smart enough to see what the issues were, get the job done, fairly efficient, effective kind of way, and got on with people. Nothing remarkable about any of that.
So partner, and more for my interest than maybe any of the listeners, but a lot of business development happens, you have to bring...
No, in those days wasn't much. The competition between law firms was nothing like it is today. There wasn't too much pressure on you to go out there and build a client base. The firm had clients and they were given to you. You did what you could.
If you're a law firm, you had 4 walls, there were people coming to you.
You had an office, you had 4 walls, but, that firm didn't really have a strong sense of purpose or who it was or what it wanted to do, except it was full of these conservative old white guys.
Not like today, Danny.
Not like today.
This was also the time that you met Tony Tobin, the other half.
Yeah, I met him
of Gilbert and Tobin.
That firm, yeah.
What was the conversation being had?
Well, we became friends. We were there for a number of years together and became partners at the same time. He was a few years older than me. And then I was made at a fairly early point a deputy managing partner at a fairly young age. And then in about 1985, 86, I was starting to do some commercial work, starting to think that maybe I could do something differently here. And I had these fairly entrepreneurial clients, in inverted commas. And they were entrepreneurial. They certainly pushed the boundaries fairly hard. And they asked me they were establishing a new tech company, would I like to go out and work with them? So I became general counsel with them. I left the firm, became general counsel with them for a couple of years, but decided that life wasn't for me. I didn't want to sort of go into that side of the business, that I wanted to continue to be a lawyer. I didn't want to go back into the firm that I'd with. This is a truncated version of the story. But I talked to Tony and a few others at that time, but talked to Tony and said, well, let's set up on our own in the city, and we did in January 1988.
From a logistic point of view, because people probably don't necessarily know that side of the story, and it might be wildly different to what it would be today, but what does it take to start a law firm?
Well, I had a pretty scrappy kind of client base. Tony had a better client base than I did. And we just got some secondhand furniture. I had a very small office. The office would have been no more than 3 or 4 times the size of this room. We had a secretary each, and we just opened the door and started doing stuff and getting out and about, talking to people. And at the end of the first year, we had quite a lot of work on.
At what point did you realise you had to start bringing in more solicitors for the work? I think we share a common friend that may have been employee number 4 in Grantley. Yeah,
it was Grantley number 4.
I think so, something like that. He speaks about it privately. Yeah, exactly.
Anyway, he was early days.
Yeah. And so was it media, tech law?
Media, tech law.
Yeah. Yeah, and that was kind of the focus of it.
That's what we wanted to give its focus to, and it was the time of the deregulation of the telecommunications in Australia. So I then spoke to a couple of smart young blokes that I knew and who were interested in this stuff, and said, why don't you join us and pick up that ball and see if we can build a telco practice? And we did. Then we decided we needed to have a more mainstream media practice, so we had to think about who in Australia could we act for. There was that time, there was the Fairfax, Murdoch and Packer. We thought the Packer was probably our best prospect, so we went about talking to other partners around town who had connections with Packer organisations, and after a period of time, persuaded them to join us. One of them was Gina Cascott-Lee, a bloke called Mark O'Brien, and that morphed into in the mid-90s, the whole tech boom started to fire up.
Recently, the Financial Times awarded you one of the global leaders for law firms, and also recognised the firm as an innovative firm. Yeah. Congrats for that. You. But I think it speaks more broadly to the firm itself and the wave of technology that you guys rode in terms of
Well, that was the start of the internet. A lot of pretty funny businesses rode on the back of that, but we were acting for them. We're acting for technology companies. We started to act for Channel 9 as well. Acted for Optus. So it was getting a real momentum, and that momentum developed throughout the period about 1992, 93, 94 through to 2000, 2001, to the time of the tech wreck.
And was there any inciting moments or any philosophies that you guys held in order?
No, not just that. We did want to make sure that we had a particular industry focus, which was around the tech and media. But we also had started to build a corporate offering as well, with a few guys that joined us from Freehills in the corporate space.
Was that kind of the thinking that you guys would niche down into a specific area to compete?
We felt that to compete you had to do that. And we got into the internet space and the telco space before the other major firms did. But by the end of the 1990s, they'd started to catch up.
Any matter or case that particularly stands out to you as a career highlight?
Well, a big case for us was within the first year. I was walking down the street and I ran into this fellow whom I knew and asked him how he was going. And he said, I've just been sued for $100 million by Warwick Fairfax. And this was to do with the takeover of Fairfax. At that time, was backed by a fellow called Laurie Connell, no longer with us, and Alan Bond. And I said to him, have you got any lawyers? So, not really. And I said, you have now. Yeah. So
for $100 million, you'd probably want to.
We started acting that. So that got us a bit of press and put a bit of that was pretty exciting. We were not well organised to take on a major piece of litigation like that.
I wanted to pivot now more to your advocacy work, arguably just as long and impressive as your legal career. Going back, and we touched on it growing up in regional New South Wales, but then going back and working there, you talked about some of the disadvantages you saw for First Nations.
Well, I remember growing up there, there was the reserve out there was called Three Ways Bridge, and you'd see the Aboriginal kids going to school. They're always in the bottom classes, didn't have shoes, not well dressed. They were pretty tough, good rugby, good footy players, could kick the shit out of everybody really. you know, and there was certainly a separation between them and the rest. And that was a very multicultural community, having been settled by Italian immigrants after the First but mainly Second World War. And I did sense that there wasn't something right here. I did not connect that with any sense of them being the first Australians or the history of Aboriginal people and their rightful entitlements flowing from that. That sensibility did not occur to me until much later in my life. One of the things that drove me to lead the firm that I was with, I decided that I wanted to do something in social justice. So I got involved in the establishment of the Community Legal Centre, growth of community legal centres in Sydney. I got involved in that in the mid-1980s, but that did not have any particular focus on Aboriginal people. But I guess that speaks to how I thought about issues of disadvantage and social justice and started to develop my commitment to make a contribution here. At or about that time, a bit later, I got involved with the Catholic Church in Redfern with the most amazing human being called Ted Kennedy, who was the parish priest there, and he and Mum Shell. You've heard of Mum Shell?
I haven't.
I'm going to get a comment from me again now.
I know.
You cannot go through life as a young Indigenous person in Sydney and not know anything about Shirley Smith. Mum Shirl, and she was a very famous Indigenous woman, inner city Indigenous woman in her time, and she worked with Ted Kennedy on the block, visiting Aboriginal people in jail. Ted converted the presbytery into a sort of a doss house for Aboriginal people who were homeless to live. The old convent was converted into a place where they fed Aboriginal people. The Aboriginal medical service started at the back of the church. Ted was profoundly important in facilitating all of that, and he worked closely at the block, and he did that for 25, 30 years. And he introduced me to Aboriginal people, and he wrote extensively about them, spoke about them in his homilies, and enlivened in me a profound sense of the injustice that was being perpetrated on Aboriginal people and the failure of the nation to give them any proper recognition. He was very critical of the church and the way the church hadn't faced up to its Christ-like responsibilities for Aboriginal people as well. And it was through Ted had been a friend of Patrick Dodson, who, as you might know, was the first Catholic priest in Australia, Aboriginal Catholic priest in Australia. I met Patrick through Ted, and then I met PDU and a number of other Indigenous leaders, Marcia Langton. After a little while, I met Noel Pearson. I started working with all of these people over many years and others, and eventually came to work more closely with Noel in Cape York. The other thing that's a bit interesting, and I look back at this with hindsight more than a triggering event. So I don't think it triggered anything much, but when I was about 18, I might have been home from university, and there was this Aboriginal fellow being interviewed on television one night, and my father, my old man, says, "See that black bastard there? Well, he's your cousin."
Mm-hmm.
And he was my father's first cousin, and we're not Indigenous, and his name was Kevin Gilbert, and he had just come out of jail after. Have you heard of Kevin Gilbert? You should. You're a black fella. You've got to know about Kevin Gilbert. He's written a lot of books.
I know you've talked about him a lot when we've spoken.
He wrote the first play by an Indigenous person, and a lot of poetry and a lot of art. So that sort of jolted with me a bit, but my family never connected with his family. So that's something that I remember that evening with great clarity. I remember my father saying that.
I think it speaks to a testament or a story of that almost every Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander family has someone in there with a very interesting story.
This man was a prominent activist, one of the people who established the tent embassy.
I'm still finding out about interesting people.
Yeah.
My great-great-great-grandmother on my maternal side wrote a letter to the King from back down in Jervis Bay, lady named Jane Duran. She wrote to the King about public schools and why do we call them public schools if black kids can't go to it?
Good question, Emma.
Got a stamp and said this has been received and not acknowledged. In 1926, great grandfather on my father's side, Jimmy Governor, was dragged back down from up north to be hung in the gallows.
Was Jimmy Governor your great?
He was on my paternal side.
This is from Merriwar.
Yes, and so
in the Hunter.
Yes.
Oh,
yes,
okay.
And so there's a book about him.
There's a book about him, movies. Yeah. So you're a direct descendant of
I am. And so that just goes to how many people out there.
Are you a fighter like he is?
Oh, look, I'll let you answer that. I think so. I want to talk about The Voice, a more modern example of trying to fight for First Nations rights here in the country. I know that you did a lot for it. In an article that you wrote, you talked about how business could play a role pushing forward First Nations rights. In the aftermath of The Voice, what do you think the role of businesses can be after The Voice has kind of fallen over?
Well, I think businesses can continue to acknowledge First Nations people in this country. They can use their economic and political power to help advance the interests of Indigenous people. They can, within their own organisations, help foster a knowledge of the history and a consciousness of the particular predicaments and the rightful place of Indigenous people in this country. There's a lot that they can do. Some might say that that's external to our main job, whatever their main job might be. I wouldn't agree with that. I think that they're corporate citizens. They have significant influence and role to play in this country. They ought to use that influence for the betterment of people in this country, descendants of the first people in this country, who still don't have proper recognition or a proper seat at the table.
Moving away from business to government, like I mentioned, we've seen the constitutional recognition at a federal level fall over, but there's been some more recent discussions about treaties at a state level. How can we ensure that government policies remain consistent and central on the Indigenous voices? And do you think the states taking carriage of this will be successful?
I'm not well versed in what's happening in each state in relation to treaty and recognition. I'm aware of a report that was published last week in Victoria. One of my worries in all of that is that they will demand things that the community won't give them, and that would just cause perhaps further tensions along the way. And I'm worried that they won't focus on the right things in all of that. I mean, treaties are important, no doubt, but what should the priorities be in Australia? In my view, priorities should be about education, social and economic advantage for individuals, for families, people. And if treaty can help advance that, then I'm a supporter of the treaties. If the treaties inhibit that in some way, then I feel a bit differently about them. I don't know the right answer. I think the economic and social advantage and wealth for Indigenous people is the only way to go. And if we have treaties, then all that those treaties do is keep them in the place that they're occupied today, then that will have been a wasted and negative effort.
I'm a subscriber that everything reverse engineers into economic empowerment. And I think the one big one for me that I see
Some of those things may not reverse engineer into that.
Oh, well, I subscribe to it, but I think that, maybe I have a naive view of it, potentially because of my background in banking. But I think, First Nations business ownership, for example, sits at approximately 4%, whereas non-Indigenous, it's about 8%. If we just reached parity, it could potentially add up to $50 billion to the GDP. But I think the biggest hurdle is how do you get there? And I think I'd love your opinion on the economic empowerment side of it. So, is it that we set up venture capital or private equity that is directly supportive of investing into First Nations
that would be
businesses?
one thing that would be worth doing, that's for sure.
Yeah.
But as I say, making sure Indigenous kids in Western Sydney have the same level of educational attainment and standing as non-Indigenous kids.
Yeah.
That's got to be of foundational importance. And then you've got kids in regional and remote Australia, where the statistics of unemployment, underemployment, poor educational outcomes are much more alarming.
Yeah.
So I have to think about those people as well. And we have to recognise, I think, land rights are important, native title is important, compensation for loss of native title. These are all building blocks along the way, but it must ultimately sound in social and economic empowerment, not from an assimilationist point of view at all, but that we can say that Indigenous people have and enjoy the same opportunities as non-Indigenous people and can contribute to the culture and life of the nation as Indigenous people. At the moment, we're happy to have Indigenous people contribute to sport and the culture of the country and take that from them. We'll say thank you for giving us that, right? We will take that, but we don't give them the other stuff, a token gesture on the part of this nation. Wait until we see the Olympic Games in Brisbane and all the carry-on there'll be and proud display of Indigenous culture and Indigenous people, what they'll be asked to do to showcase Australia. I'm happy with that, but I'm not happy with that.
Pivoting again more towards the future, you've long supported Indigenous advocacy. We've just spoken quite a bit about that. What do you think young Indigenous Australians need today to become leaders of tomorrow? I know that we've touched on a lot of it.
They need to be educated. They need to understand who they are. They need to understand the history of their people. And they need to understand the challenges. Now, do they do that with the hat of an Indigenous advocate, or do they do that as an Indigenous person just succeeding and showing the way? I think both are important and good.
Again, zooming out even a bit further, for young law students and young lawyers, what are some advice that you'd give people just starting out in the profession?
Work out what you want to do, focus, work hard, learn, take a few knocks and be ambitious.
We have discussed this previously, but AI, what's your thoughts on it in terms of the impact on the industry?
Oh, I think AI will have a profound impact. We're now even starting to learn a bit more about AI agents, the impact that they're going to have. That we'll have our own AI agent that'll be able to do everything for us. So I don't know, it's going to be profound, but how to see where its impact is going to be in every moment of professional life is difficult.
For me, it's a scary thought to think that I'll come into the office and the only person I'll talk to is my AI agent. It does seem like
it's an unattractive notion.
People are relying on it a lot more.
Yeah.
And then my AI agent will talk to someone else's AI agent and I will never have to pick the phone up to speak to them.
Yeah, that's all troubling, isn't it? I agree.
A little bit.
What's that going to do to the human condition?
That's it for this episode of Yarns. A huge thank you to Danny Gilbert for such a generous and wide-ranging conversation. From his early days in the country in New South Wales to building one of Australia's top law firms and his enduring commitment to justice and reconciliation. It's not every day you get to hear from someone who's shaped both the legal profession and the national conversation so deeply. If you've enjoyed this episode, please follow or subscribe, leave a review, and share it with someone who'd find value in these yarns. Take care of yourselves and your loved ones. Yarn to you next time.